So I'm spending a few hours walking around Mount Moriah. It's not really abandoned anymore. It once was an abandoned cemetery. 200,000 graves here. Started in the 1850s. By 1950s, 100 years later, it was really in disrepair, and it got worse and worse. A lot of interesting graves. I'm going to take you through some of them if I can find them. They have been working on this cemetery a lot and have really done fantastic work. I've been here a few times over the last 10 years. Certainly 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, there were huge swaths of land, just complete woods. You're just trekking through the woods and there's just gravestones everywhere. So they've really done a great job. This is the original gatehouse where you would enter into the cemetery. I'll show you the front in a second, but there used to be a statue of Father Time. It's been moved just behind it to John H. Jones' plot. That's Father Time right up there. John H. Jones was locally known, I guess known more for being a butcher than anything. A lot of people think that he was on the board of directors of Mount Moriah Cemetery. I don't believe he was. I'm not really sure why they put Old Father Time here, but imagine years ago walking through this cemetery and this is all woods and you're just coming through and you look up and you see Father Time looking down at you, judging you. I told you I would show you this beautiful old gatehouse constructed in the Romanesque revival style. This was created shortly after the cemetery opened. It was the formal entrance and administrative office. I remember being here many years ago and the roof had not caved in yet. But now it's sad to see that it's really completely gone. I bet if it weren't for these stabilization efforts here, the walls would have totally fallen in on itself. And there's many people that would love to see it restored. I'd love to see it restored as well. But it would definitely cost several millions of dollars. So who knows? You know, it's a massive undertaking, this entire property and situation. You can see that beautiful wood window framing has survived the test of time. So Mount Moriah was established in 1855. It ultimately would expand well over 200 acres. There are some estimates of even over 300 acres. There's lots of military plots here, Civil War veterans, over 3,000 different veterans are buried here. Betsy Ross was interred here along with her husband in 1856. And back then this was a very freshly established, beautiful rolling hills park-like cemetery. Fast forward 100 years later, the cemetery was on its decline, following the path of the surrounding neighborhoods. The upkeep became an issue, vandalism, illegal dumping, and then by 2011 the cemetery was closed, totally abandoned, as the last owner or the last person on the administrative board died in 2004. There was really no one left to oversee the upkeep, and by 2011 it was completely abandoned and overgrown. Now, I remember being here years and years ago. I remember seeing it like that, severely overgrown. It was a haven for dumping, grave robbing. And so fast forward to these days, past 10 years or so, there have been amazing efforts to clear and revitalize this land, this property. Little by little, this cemetery has been brought back to life, pun intended, due to organizations, donations, city grants. And try to imagine that years ago this would have been just forest, absolutely overgrown. So even though parts of it still are fairly overgrown, it's just leaps and bounds. They have done so much with this property. So this is the grave of the Gale Sisters. It was 4 sisters. They were ballerinas, traveling dancers their whole lives. They traveled all over the place performing. And They were in Philadelphia one night at the Continental Theater, which is long gone. It's burned down like 3 times. Burned down, rebuilt, burned down, rebuilt. Now it's a parking lot. So the story goes is one of the sisters, they were getting ready for the second act, and she was putting on her outfit, and she reached for something and grabbed or knocked over a lantern or something with flame, and her outfit caught fire, and then other people were trying to help her put it out. It was spread to other people, spread to curtains. It was getting bigger. There was 1,500 people in the theater, so it definitely wasn't necessarily a small theater. It reminds me of that story that I did of Great White, that band Great White up in Rhode Island, where they were setting off their pyrotechnics during their concert, and it caught the ceiling on fire, and like 100 people died. Same type of thing. It just got out of control very quickly, and everything just went up very quickly, and I believe 9 dancers died. They just were trapped. Some girls were jumping out of the windows, but 9 of them died, including the 4 Gale Sisters, and they're buried here at Mount Moriah. So this is one of the more fascinating graves here, at least to me. This is Robert Heler. He was a magician. His real name was William Henry Palmer. I believe he grew up in the UK. His father was a professional musician, so he went up the ranks. He went through the schools to be a musician, and he had a professional career as a musician, but he really became fascinated at some point with magic, and he left the Royal Academy of Music, moved to New York, and opened up a magician museum or a show, really. It was called Heler's Hall of Wonders, and he opened it in 1851. It's interesting because this was right around the same time of P.T. Barnum, when P.T. Barnum had his American Museum freak shows and things like that. I wonder if they knew each other, if they ever worked together. After about 6 months, he left there, toured around the East Coast, Baltimore, Boston, certainly here in Philadelphia. He bounced around a lot. He ended up getting married, had some kids. After the Civil War, he started his traveling magic show up again, did that for about 6 years, and then opened a place in Philadelphia again. And then tragically, November 25th, 1878, I don't know if it was on stage or not, but he collapsed. And he died Thanksgiving Day, just a few days later, November 28th, 1878, I believe of pneumonia. Now here's the interesting thing. When choosing his professional name, he chose Robert Heler after a magician he idolized, Jean-Eugene Robert Houdin. After Robert Heler passed away, a young magician named Eric Weiss also borrowed his professional name from Robert Houdin, and that was a young Harry Houdini. And so the pictures, there's photos of Harry Houdini. He came here in 1910 when this cemetery was probably beautiful. He was on tour and he wanted to stop and pay his respects to Robert Heler. And the photos are amazing. It's really incredible to be able to stand where someone like Harry Houdini stood, which is, I'm standing right here. In fact, that became very popular after this. When those photos were published, people started coming here and recreating those photos. I just think that's fascinating. And it's very different. I don't know. I tried to line it up with these different graves. Who knows? Lots of things have changed. So John McAuliff was a very famous Shakespearean actor. He was born in Ireland. He was orphaned. He and his sister came over to live with a cousin in Philadelphia, and it was here. I think he was working for the family business where he was building chairs, making wooden chairs, and then he got into acting, and then he debuted on stage 1857 at the Arch Street Theater, the same theater that John Wilkes Booth was performing at. He toured around the country, but eventually came back to Philly, and he worked at the Walnut Street Theater. In 1884, he was performing at McVicker's Theater in Chicago, and he had a breakdown on stage. Everybody in the audience was like, oh, come on, he's drunk, but no, he really had issues. He was indeed suffering from paralysis. He was committed to Bloomingdale Asylum after doctors declared him legally insane. And after some time, he returned home to Philadelphia, where he died of cerebral thrombosis, basically a blood clot in his brain. Now, this monument was constructed in 1888 and paid for by many friends and family and admirers of his. It cost $9,300, which is well over $300,000 in today's money. And he had amassed decent wealth at the time, $33,000, which is well over $1 million in today's money. And that money was left to his wife, Letitia, and his 2 sons. However, just 3 months after McAuliff died, his son William died, and then Letitia died in 1888, the same year that this monument actually went up. So this monument was very fresh, and his wife died. So all that money was left to his son James, who then died in 1892. So kind of strange how things work out sometimes. And I believe there's like a crest or a shield. I can feel it. There's an outline because there used to be a brass, I don't know what you would call it, like a shield or a crest or something was here, but that was stolen. But you can see that where it was. Another very interesting story that took place here in 2017, 2 remains were found, ones that were not officially ever interred on these grounds, murders tied to the Warlocks motorcycle gang. And I'll probably end up doing a separate video about this, but their bodies were discovered inside an open crypt, something that was very common on this property, that you could find these crypts that had been opened and robbed. So Betsy Ross is widely recognized for sewing or creating the first American flag. However, that is largely considered a myth by historians. To be clear, there's really no evidence to support it. However, there's also really no evidence to support that she wasn't the first as well. So if you didn't know, Betsy Ross used to be buried here, is still buried here. There's some discrepancies with that. She was buried with her husband, who died previous to her death, and they were buried in a different cemetery. I believe some years later, a few decades later, a couple decades later, Philadelphia purchased that land and they wanted to develop it or whatever. So everybody that was buried there had to be removed. So her family said, okay, let's move her out. This was 1856. This cemetery was brand new. It had just basically opened for business, we'll say, in 1855. So it was a very pretty cemetery. It was a nice place to be buried. So they said, let's bury her at Mount Moriah. Fast forward back, or I guess into like the 50s and 60s, Mount Moriah really started falling off. The whole surrounding area was really not a very nice area. A lot of vandalism happening here, a lot of neglect, and it just wasn't a very nice cemetery anymore. And that's when the talk started of removing her and bringing her somewhere else. So in 1975, they exhumed her body, or so they think. They dug down. They made a couple different attempts to dig down. Apparently there's 4 people buried in this section, or in this area, possibly 6. And when they dug down to where her body was supposed to be, they found actually some male bones, and they did find part of a female skull. So ahead of this nation's bicentennial celebration, her remains were reportedly exhumed and moved to the courtyard of the Betsy Ross house in Old City. The thing is that there was no DNA back then. They couldn't really be sure. I think there are 6 people that were buried here. I think they were under pressure to move her remains, or whatever remains they say were hers. It could very well be that there are some remains still here and some remains at her home in Old City. They've put a plaque here. There's a new gravestone and a flagpole because they were both stolen years and years ago. And you can still come here and pay your respects, and go to her house in Old City and pay your respects. So anyway, yeah, that's the progress that's going on here in Mount Moriah. And some of the more interesting graves that I could find, at least. Some of these, they're really difficult to find. Even the maps they give you are kind of confusing. And oddly enough, more people than I would ever think have been taken out. Probably they were removed when this cemetery was abandoned. Interesting situation here. Still working on it, as you can see. All right, I'm getting out of here. See you in the next video.